Mark, I'm going to leave the questions there for the moment, and I'm going to ask you to stay online, please, and join our panel discussion. Could I also ask a number of other people to join the panel discussion, please? One of our other speakers, Rodrigo Garcia Gonzalez from Notpla, is going to join this panel. And we also have two other guests, and I'd like to introduce them as they switch their camera and microphones on, please, if I may. First and foremost, we're going to be joined by Matthew Snyder, who's a senior advisor at McKinsey. Matthew is a leader in the paper and packaging practice and focuses on the paper, plastics, glass, and metal packaging segments. He leverages his expertise, and his prior experience was in the packaging industry. He advises clients on strategy, operations, procurement, and due diligence. And last but by no means least to join our panel, Claire Shrewsbury. Claire is the Director of Insights and Innovation at RAP and is responsible for RAP's policy and insights work, technical support for local authorities, and UK grant management. RAP teams support DEFRA in the implementation of the resource and waste strategy and similar support programmes for the devolved governments in Wales and Northern Ireland. Claire joined RAP in 2008 and previously was a consultant with AEA Technology. The panel we're going to have is entitled Influencing Consumer Attitudes and Behaviour Towards Packaging. And I think we've actually started with one of the comments that Mark's just started with. So as a more general question, if everyone is reasonably happy with their introduction, and Mark, you've had a chance to draw a breath after your presentation, could I start with a wide question, if I may, and could I remind all the participants to put their questions in Slido, please? They'll be fed in and I'll obviously ask the panel. But we've talked and we've touched upon society and consumers. So as a first question, what do the panelists think matters to consumers regarding packaging? And is that changing? And has it changed? Mark, could we start with you because you're still there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's the biodegradable, compostable they like, without really questioning it at all. I think for the rest of it, my feeling is that they feel negatively about plastic packaging, but they still love it. You know, deep down. Will buy stuff that is, they trust stuff wrapped in plastic packaging in supermarkets more than they trust things that are not. And I think that's a deep, deep emotional kind of connection to a way of shopping that's about cleanliness and trust and also norms, cultural norms that I think are very hard to shift.
Oh, I was just going to add, I mean, we run a recycling tracker regularly, and we've seen that actually the consumers are more concerned about plastics now than they were in 2018. If you remember, 2018 was the whole Blue Planet explosion, but actually they feel that what they can do about it has actually gone down. They feel probably a bit more disillusioned, so they're much more concerned about plastics packaging, but feel that they can't do very much about it. So which is probably not a great way for them to feel, really.
Matthew, I'm sorry I interrupted. Please.
No, that's quite all right. I agree with what Claire and Mark have said. And before I dig into that a bit more, let me just thank the Royal Society and the fellow panelists. It's really quite an honor to be here today. Recently at McKinsey, we conducted a survey of 10,000 global consumers across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. And I'll share some of the findings because I think it's really quite relevant here. First off is that we found consumers are highly concerned about sustainability, but they're also highly confused. And what I mean by that is that they've expressed a varied view of what the top concerns around sustainability are. So we hear about carbon footprint, we hear about recycling, we hear about leakage into the environment, but there isn't a lot of consistency in those. and they disagree on which types of packaging are most sustainable. They do, however, agree on what the least sustainable options are. So there seems to be broad acceptance that packaging combining plastic, paper, and aluminum, so multi-substrate, is least sustainable. There isn't a lot of alignment around what is most sustainable. We hear from some consumers it's paper-based packaging. We hear from others it's compostable films. We hear from others it's glass jars. And we did hear in this recent survey something that changed a little bit to Claire's point on the changes, which is that most consumers say that they are willing to pay for more sustainable products and sustainable packaging. However, when we look at the point of sale data, we can't really connect that necessarily the same way that we'd like to be able to prove that out. And when we look at some of their buying factors, they highlight environmental and social impact at the bottom of the list, after function and value and other things that we see in general.
Thank you very much for that. Rodrigo, as someone who is bringing a novel product to the market that allegedly ticks all the boxes that your panelists have mentioned, would you like to chip in on that one? You have it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, we don't claim that our solution works for everything, and we are conscious that like it just works for a specific niche of applications, normally low volume, short time consumption. So just to make that clarification first. Then what matters to consumers in terms of packaging? I believe that like sustainability is one of the factors, but it's not the main priority when consumers choose a product. They are normally driven by other type of, I suppose, experience or values or other perceptions that the packaging gives towards the product than just the sustainable packaging. I think we live in a society that we still don't see this less is more as a value, and that's something that from the consumer perspective, it's quite challenging, because on one hand you want to have something that is sustainable, but at the same time that is premium, and at the same time that adds an experience. So sometimes it's quite hard to match all these things. I always say as well that I think most of these solutions that we're trying to find nowadays, we had them in the past. We always have been able to shop products and to buy and to feed ourselves and to transport goods without the use of plastic, for example. So it's a quite recent problem and quite recent solution and material that we have been working with. So if we look back a couple of generations ago, where we didn't have these materials available, and what type of system we had in place to trade and to consume and to drink, and we will find quite a lot of solutions that will probably still relevant nowadays.
I think it's a really good point to make, how society changes and looks at different solutions. Clara, you were talking about trends in the markets. If I may throw in something a little bit outlandish, over the last couple of years, we've had the epidemic of coronavirus, and we've certainly seen in the UK food ordering moving online. Is there an increasing problem of plastic pollution? And what would we do about something like that?
So I think, I mean, obviously we've all gone through the mill a bit, haven't we, in the last 18 months? So, and we know people adapted and took on different behaviours. So, I mean, just touching on food, I mean, obviously food waste is one of the biggest environmental challenges that we've got. And I'm not saying that plastics and packaging isn't, but actually food waste is one that, you know, is another area that WRAP really tackles. So how those go hand in hand, should food be wrapped in plastic to prevent food waste, or shouldn't it? So we've just done some work actually, and we'll be releasing that quite soon to actually see how the impact of packaged food or unpackaged food impacts on that food waste, because obviously the packaging comes with loads of instructions about storage, either the best before date, the use before date, and thankfully the sell by date has gone now for many pieces of packaging. But you know, that is massively confusing for many citizens. If you take that away, they go back and they use their intuition, and they'll use their nose, and they'll tell whether the milk is off, or the cucumber can be eaten. And so we you know, all of these different behaviours come into play. So we're just trying to distill all of that information, and we'll have a really interesting piece on packaging and versus food waste. But I think, you know, the shift to home delivery, it depends on the system, doesn't it? I mean, there are systems out there that are refill systems, you know, Good Food Club, you know, they will deliver to your door, and it's a refill system. So we're also talking with organisations to try and make refill and, you know, eliminating packaging completely part of the everyday norm. But we have to appreciate that that is still only going to be acceptable to a certain percentage of the population. The vast majority of people still, like we've said, are just going to buy what they can buy, and dispose of what they can. You know, we know that we can't seem to help them what we call miscapture. So we know that we sort of run our tracker and we say, what did you do with the last piece of packaging? You know, what did you do with the last can of beans? And they'll say whether they recycled it or disposed of it in the bin. And we'll then map that onto what their collection scheme was. So we know whether it's missed capture or it's the overzealous recycler. And we know that there's still so much missed packaging that could have been recycled. And we're working really hard to try and tackle that. But that is a challenge.
Definitely a challenge. Mark, taking Claire's point a stage further, never mind the fancy technology, trust the consumer. How does that fit with some of your work?
Well, I mean, I have a problem with the word consumer, to be honest. I feel like if you tell people that they're consumers, they'll consume. And I would say we should call people citizens more. And I wish the economists would stop calling everyone consumers, because really, if you call them recyclers, maybe we'd actually, you know, maybe the word itself would, and maintainers and people who are, you know, custodians of the world, you know, if we call them custodians, then you change the whole framework in which you're treating these individual citizens. So that's that's the thing I always kind of come back to. I mean, I guess the other thing is, I feel like there's sort of 10% of people who are really, really active and spend a lot of time and effort trying to do the right thing. But for most people, they're either they don't care, or they're so busy that this is so down their list of priorities that, you know, they care, but they feel guilty about not actually doing it. And I think we just need to design a system for those, because that's, I think, the reality going forward. We need a system that's so simple that you don't have to think, you don't have to look at a label. And my feeling is that it's rationalization of the plastic formats so that they're all recyclable, and I think we're going in the right direction. And then it's automatic detection, and 2 bins in the home, food waste separation, and so the wet stuff and the dry stuff. And that's all you should ask the citizen to have to do.
I think the question of terminology is one we'll pick up as well, because calling people recyclers rather than consumers, I think, is worth a conversation. Matthew, we're talking about, I mean, this symposium today is largely focused on the UK. When we look at different markets, do we see very different things when we talk about sustainable packaging in this place? Are we assuming too much?
We do see differences across the world. And the first difference I'll point to is one of infrastructure. This kind of goes to what Mark was talking about earlier with the compostable value chain, if you will. When the infrastructure isn't in place for something relatively simple, such as recycling, it means that we're going to have a challenge in getting those recycling rates up, right? So first we have to figure out how to establish that infrastructure. And we'll just take one example. So you take the bottle of water or the bottle of soda or something like that. Typically, someone's consuming those single servings on the go. Most of the infrastructure that we have in the United States, and I believe a substantial portion in the UK and continental Europe as well, is centered around the home, right? And I had the opportunity to live in France about 20 years ago, and there were local collections all over the city, you know, where you had big bins, right, that were all separated, and you could go and drop things off. And that was a part of the culture, and it was developing in that time. We don't have that in the States. You don't see that in Latin America, and you see that very infrequently in Asia as well. So until we can figure out how to build and fund that infrastructure, I think we're going to see this challenge around the globe.
Rodrigo, taking some of the points that have just been made and actually looking at where your business is positioned, are we actually working too far down the waste hierarchy? Should we be looking at this in a different way with elimination, reduction and reuse? Do you want to just take a comment on that one? And then I'm actually going to come back to the rest of the panel on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably the first step for every single challenge that we have in packaging is reduction and elimination of that need. For example, what Mackey was saying about like consumption on the go of plastic bottles. And if you're going to invest in infrastructure of recycling those plastic bottles on the go, probably is much better use of public funds to invest on public fountains to avoid in the first place, the need of that object. So yeah, I think wherever you have a strategy is to avoid that consumption, if that makes sense. A bit coming back to what Mark was saying of like not seeing people as consumers by definition, but seeing them as citizens. I think it's the first goal for every single problem, and wherever is, yeah, it can be avoided in one way or another, not just for normally that way of avoiding is through systems or through different ways of thinking how that problem could be solved, not just by innovative materials.
Claire, we should be teaching the waste hierarchy better. We're not doing a great job. What do you think?
Yeah.
Sorry, Claire.
Sorry, Geoff, I missed the beginning. What did you say? I'm
suggesting we should be teaching the waste hierarchy better. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we know we're not going to recycle our way out of the issue. You know, we recognise that, and we've got to, you know, we've got to prevent as well as manage. So, you know, all of these different new business models that are coming on, refillables, etc., will help to challenge what has been the, you know, make, take, make, consume, throw away kind of linear economy that we've been used to for the last, you know, 30, 40 years. I mean, you know, I am old enough to remember deposits, and they'll be coming back in the UK. So, you know, that's again, but that's coming, retrofitting a deposit scheme with when we've got a very comprehensive curbside system. So, you know, that will have impacts on the infrastructure, not only on the, you know, the trucks that go past our houses every week to collect our recyclables, that the mixture of materials that go into those will be changing if bottles and cans, you know, drinks containers are removed from what you put out every week. You imagine what's in your bin. So yeah.
And I'm sorry to do this to you, Mark. Can I just widen that out slightly, because Claire's made a fabulous point about how we measure sustainability. What do we think sustainability and sustainable packaging means to the average consumer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a confusion. That, so if people answer the question, they'll probably say that some materials like paper are sustainable, or wood, pulp, and I think, and others perhaps are not. They'd say plastic. They'd single out plastic. I mean, the truth is that no material is sustainable. Glass is not sustainable. Wood, paper, plastic. Only a system is sustainable, and a system. There are very few systems of recycling in this country, the UK, and probably worldwide, that are truly sustainable. And I think so. Trying to get people to away from this thing. This material is sustainable. This one isn't. That's number one. We need to get people to system think. But of course, that feels like a very abstract concept to most people. But as soon as you say to them, look, what do you think's happening at the end of life to that children's toy you just bought? Like, you bought it. You know, the kid wants it. I'm guilty of this too, by the way. And now it arrives, and hooray! And then about half an hour later, it's sort of at the corner, and then maybe a day later, it's forgotten. And now you have you have electronics, you have packaging, you have batteries, you have lots of different types of plastic, and you never thought about, oh, I'm never going to be able to really recycle that. But if you were to think about that before you buy it, and say, well, there's no system in this country to recycle it, so I'm not going to buy it. well, then I think we'd be in a much better place. But it seems utopian.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's a, where do people think that throwing away is? There is no place called away where all of these things go to. And I think that's a really powerful lesson to try and teach people. Where do they think it ends up?
And I think that's a great point. Matthew, we're now talking about not buying children toys because actually they don't look after them. Now, that's a completely different societal conversation. How do we talk about systems and processes with businesses involved to make circularity work? How does that happen?
Yeah, well, it's a good thing we don't go into the toys a bit more because I've got 4 young kids, so that would be a big problem for us. But in terms of the circularity overall, I think we have to look at 2 different angles. One is understanding what consumer, or in Mark's terms, citizens' preferences are, and trying to figure out how to cater to them in the most sustainable way possible. We may not get to a full level of sustainability, but it's the spectrum. The second is then, what are things that we can do in our positions of influence to figure out how to bend that trend and start to move people in a different direction, to Claire's point, around more reusability, for example, and those types of areas. So on the first side, it's hard for me as a packaging operator, a former packaging operator, and now someone who advises packaging clients to say we should eliminate all packaging, right? I think that the challenge that I would put out to the group here is to think about the 3 typical uses for packaging. First, you've got containment, making sure something doesn't fall out. Second, you've got the protective nature of packaging, particularly for shipment. And then third is the marketing side of it, right? So where can we push and pull on those levers such that we can come up with the most sustainable package option? For instance, do we look at primary and secondary packaging? Say, a bottle of scotch that sits in a corrugated container. Or a folding carton, right? How do we look at those 2 and figure out the best way to put them together to reduce the amount that we have, and therefore take a lot of that end of life and disposable out of the equation because we just don't have as much material to deal with?
I think the question of a bottle of scotch is a good one, because I could make the glib remark about alcohol not being a requirement for human life, but we'll leave that one for another time. I mean, we've actually started to touch on a whole range of interesting topics. Rodrigo, can I bring you back to one of your pieces of expertise, design? How do we look at design? How do we design both systems and products to enable this to be better? Because we've touched on education and we've touched on processes. Rodrigo, could you pick that one up?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I suppose design by itself is a powerful tool to look at systems and to look at products. For us, for example, we use design to look at how nature does things like packaging, and is one of the most innovative ways, I suppose, of package things. If you look at fruits, for example, it's a really clear example of how to answer those questions that, like Matthew was asking, in terms of how to brand, how to differentiate different products, how to unify first and secondary packaging together, how to make a packaging regenerative, right? Like you eat an apple or you eat almost an avocado or any kind of fruit. And once you finish, you can home compost or you can throw it away, but you can plant it as well. And a new apple tree or a new coconut tree or a new avocado tree will grow with more products, right? With more packaging. Imagine if you could do that, right? Like, if you drink your bottle and you throw it, and a new bottle, a tree will grow with more soda bottles. That seems like visionary, but like that's something that's happening. Like that's reality, and that has been reality for centuries. So I think we should try to aim for that type of things. And I suppose that type of provocations or that type of change of mentality or things like, oh, you could eat your packaging. They come sometimes from design angles. And it doesn't need to, it's just matching different type of fields and conceptions of what things needs to be.
I mean, a completely different way of thinking. Mark, I'll bring you back in here when we talk about novel thinking and direction. I personally will shy away from growing avocados, Rodrigo. But Mark, what about different uses of packaging? What about future uses of packaging? Is that something you've looked at?
Well, is it? No, not really. I mean, I guess I wanted to quickly say something, talk to what Rodrigo was saying, which is that just wanted to make this distinction between local and global. And I think that's something we haven't really talked about. And I think it's important because if I think of, I sort of feel like there's some local loops that are going to be really important that are sort of absent at the moment for lots of reasons, but actually have many, many benefits potentially. But it does depend on where you are in the world as to how local will make sense. So you know, when packaging is this very lightweight, often, well, plastic packaging is very lightweight material, and it scatters throughout the world. It comes from a factory for one product, let's say, and it's scattered. And then to put it back again, to recycle it, there's a lot of energy involved there. So it makes a lot of sense to do some of the recycling and composting steps locally from an energy perspective. And what do you gain from that? Well, you gain local jobs, you gain an understanding of materials and an engagement with a process where your stuff goes. To answer, you know, to talk about Claire's, well, where does stuff go? Well, it goes to my local thing. But now it's not a dump. Now it's a manufacturing site. Now it's a composting site. And to me, I think that's how humans work. The kind of, the future is that our localities are making materials out of the stuff we throw away. And that will be marvelous. And personally, I love my compost heap because it does that. I grow veg out of my waste, and every year I just scratch my head in amazement and think, wow. And surely if we can get the rest of the manufacturing to work like that, so locally you can see it, I think it's really important that. Then I think that's a kind of future I can imagine, happening.
Claire, systems opportunities, novel thinking with packaging. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the system has to change, doesn't it? I mean, and
well, the fact that it has to and it will is another part of this conversation. So let's work on the principle we're going to change the system.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we should show a whole lot of evidence for that, but we'll come back to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, Mark showed some future slides. I mean, and obviously one of the other game changers is the reforms that are happening within the UK. So, actually making producers more responsible for their packaging is going to have to make them think about how recyclable it is, because they will be paying more money for that packaging at its end of life than if they put a simple piece of packaging on that flows through the system. So actually the change in regime that will be happening over the next few years will also, we believe, have a big impact on what's put onto the market, and take some of the complexity out, or force the system to cope with those more difficult to recycle materials, because otherwise the economics is just going to blow them through. You know, the cost of that responsibility is just not one that can be borne out by the producer.
Matthew, we're talking about systems and innovation again. When you're talking to your stakeholders, where do you get to with that conversation?
Well, I think it comes back to what we talked about at the very start of this conversation, which was that there just isn't a lot of consensus around what sustainable packaging looks like. So the way that we're addressing that is suggesting to our clients that you have to think about a broad portfolio of solutions, right? So you may have a compostable solution where that makes sense for an end market. You may have a recyclable solution. You know, you may look at some different options where you can lower the carbon footprint overall, and there may be trade-offs around price or functionality or whatever it might be. But it's important to have that broad portfolio. The downside of that, though, is by having such a broad portfolio, you probably lead to even more confusion because it's still not clear. So is there a way that the industry, whatever that means exactly, can come together and figure out how to define what sustainability looks like, not just for packaging, but for all of the products that we're talking about packaging, going back to the toy discussion we had before, right? Is there a way that we can develop a unified scorecard of some sort so that people can understand those trade-offs? And then you can put a financial or a social kind of cost against those and try and steer people into the right direction that we want to go to as global citizens.
Helping citizens understand sustainability. Now there's a nirvana worth exploring. Mark, do you want to chip in? Because you've changed our language already in the last half an hour. We're talking about citizens. Where do we go with this one next?
I think, well, we do start with the schools. And I do think there's a huge enthusiasm when you go and visit schools, and I do that. The kids care about this big time, more than the adults, their parents do, I think. And they've got time. They aren't so busy, perhaps, but they care. And I think they will push their behavior of their parents. So I think we have to go for schools in terms of changing what they think their future is and their role in society. And I think guardianship of the environment and in understanding what they buy and how they buy it and what they do afterwards is really important. So I mean, it does come down to education. The other thing is, for the adults, and I guess for the companies, money matters. I mean, big time, more than anything, I guess. And so basically, if the packaging's worth money, once you've used it, then it'll become sustainable. I'm absolutely convinced of this. The money has to flow where you want the material to flow. So you design the system, but you have to make sure the system flows with the money, because that's human nature. Let's not kid ourselves. So on the one hand, I'm thinking I want to stop using consumers. On the other hand, I'm thinking, but economics is the way. Actually, it's just I don't want the name, but I do want the money.
Yeah, I mean,
can I push a little bit on that comment, Mark?
Please do, because I'm about to take a swing as well. Go for it, Matthew.
If we look at least into the recycling stream, aluminum, generally speaking, has a very high amount of value associated with it, right? But as you think about whether recycling aluminum is really sustainable, you've got to factor in the carbon and the energy, right? So the carbon for the collecting it and then bringing it back into a furnace where you're going to melt it again, and the energy that goes into that versus if you just use something completely different from the beginning. So how do you think about that, Mark?
That's about the money and the taxes being aligned, as Claire was saying. You've got to align the taxes to the carbon content. I think that is going to be difficult globally, because to get everyone to agree, we can't even tax aviation fuel. No one will even agree to that. So what, in a way, I feel like you're right. Is it utopian to think that the money will drive this, that the tax, the global carbon tax situation will work for us? But if it doesn't, then I don't see how else, because I do think that people are motivated more by money than anything else, and companies are. And whatever they say in public, ultimately they're competing cat and dog with each other. And I think people in the street are like that too, to be honest.
I'm going to have to take my personal views and put them over here somewhere, Mark, because you and I are definitely due a conversation. I mean, going back a step, we talked about education and pester power, bringing the kids to bear. Rodrigo, have you looked at this as part of what you've been doing with something? Because obviously you went into a completely new market.
Yes, sure. I suppose for us, for example, to add an experience and to simplify things, like you could eat your packaging, for example, it makes a really clear statement and almost a way of differentiating ourselves against other type of biopolymers or all this confusion that there is on the market in terms of like what is compostable, what is biodegradable, what is sustainable. Having said that, and a bit linked with the conversation before on how to educate or how to get back, for example, I think that the person that I know that like knows what sustainability is, but doesn't know the definition the best is my grandpa. My grandpa lives in a village in Spain. He reuses everything. He doesn't consume almost plastic. When he has to recycle, he recycles everything. Not because there is a standard way of recycle, but because there is quite a lot of informal systems coming to collect, and they pay differently if the paper that you give is just cardboard, or if it's white paper, or the different type of metals, or the different type of glass. You separate the green glass and transparent glass, so it works really well, and they have this value of materials really into their heart. and they keep things that they think it could be valuable at some point for someone. So I think it's bringing back a bit of that common sense back to our society, that things cost money and there are resources involved into it, not only into packaging, into other things, and repairing things as well is important. And so basically it's bringing a bit of that. I understand that we have different channels nowadays and different ways of consuming and different ways of living. But like if we bring a bit back of that common sense into our society nowadays and we refresh it, I think it could be extremely powerful.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, this panel is all about looking at attitudes and behavior and how to change them. Claire, education and the work that RAP does, I mean, what more can we all do to move this conversation forward?
Yeah, so we've been obviously running the Recycle Now campaign for probably about 20 years. And, you know, we do that through a number of partners. We work with all the local authorities to try and help them get the messages across to their residents and the citizens in their space. We've done work with schools, and I agree, Mark, I think it's a great place, and kids, I don't know how old your kids are, but you know, they're all really enthusiastic till about 12. And then there's a real, if you're going to rebel against anything, doing the recycling is probably the top of the list of, I'm going to be a rebellious kid. So you then have to work and get them back in again. And we've worked with youth groups. I think we've even got a Scouts badge that we've worked with the Scouts on for recycling. So it is a really important segment of society. But we also know that families that have got children are actually some of the worst offenders for contaminating. Now, whether that's kids being a little bit over enthusiastic and thinking everything should be recycled. So there's still a balance to be had. And I think it's just that constant reminder, you know, so the other things under the regulatory reforms will be consistent labelling so that people can see I am recyclable or I'm not recyclable. And then if that then coincides with a consistent collection scheme and it all knits together as well as we hope it's going to knit together, then we've got a bit of a hope that people will get it right, because we don't want contaminated recycling. You know, that just takes all the value out of the stream.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, Matthew, we're looking at you now because we're now worried that your kids will just refuse to do recycling. What are you going to do about this?
So my kids, I'm very fortunate and blessed. They are all very passionate about recycling. And we've just crossed over that threshold you mentioned, Claire, right? So our oldest is 13. But my kids actually have a different perspective on it because I'm a packaging guy and I show them around stuff, right? But they want to understand, why, if they have a PLA cup, why isn't there a place that they can put that where they know it's going to have a good end of life? Because we don't have, at least here in the Chicago area, we don't have a chain for compostable packaging. Those cups can't be home composted, at least the ones that we typically see here. And so they end up in the rubbish bin. And going to the landfill just seems wrong, right? It is wrong. And so they push me to say, why can't you do more with your clients to figure out how to get a better solution here for other products? But I think the education component is critical, right? And I think it's an issue of changing behavior. And it takes a generation to change behaviors overall. But we've got to provide that infrastructure, coming back to what I said earlier, so that it really makes it harder not to be thinking about the right end of life than it does just to throw something into the bin.
I mean, the infrastructure is massively important, because you can keep campaigning and telling people to recycle more, but if they've only got a very small recycling container and it fills up within half a week because everything is recyclable, then they can't recycle the rest of it because they don't have the facility to do that. So everything has to, this is where the systems thinking comes in. Have I got the big enough container? Is it collected frequently enough so that you can really engage? Because, you need the citizen and the resident to be really engaged with that, because if they're not, then they'll just give up.
And it's got to be easy, right? To the point we were talking about before. It can't be more difficult because the people will generally default to the easy answer unless they're really inspired.
I mean, can I just come back to another question from the audience, which I think lends itself naturally to this conversation. Recent UK government waste consultations appear to require solutions to be industry-led. And the question is, shouldn't solutions be led by science or society working with industry? Who would like to pick that one up?
Well, just say that RAP have been doing that for so long. I mean, in the UK, we're blessed with having RAP because RAP's been leading from the front on this for 20 years in the UK, and that is society. As I say, it's a non-for-profit, and it glues. And you do a very difficult job, actually, Claire, gluing industry's pressures on wanting to, not increase their margins or decrease their margins with society's needs. So I agree, and I think maybe people don't really understand what RAP is, and that's really what the major stuff is happening in the UK. And we feed into RAP stuff, and we try and solve problems at the university level at a longer term, for longer bigger problems, I suppose, or not bigger problems, sorry, ones that don't have for which there is no technical solution, I suppose. So I think it's a good question, but I think that actually that has been happening. It's just that it hasn't, it's until the Blue Planet happened, I don't think society, RAP were just getting on with their work. And society hadn't really started to worry about it. They hadn't got up far enough the list of the to-do list. Suddenly everyone was really worried about it. And so there were votes. There were votes in plastic waste. And as soon as there were votes in plastic waste, then you really saw money going into these things. And now we're seeing legislation. And so I think the question is the right one, but I think it's actually happening. Democracy is happening in this country, in the UK, and it is pushing us in the right direction. I see hope. I think that's hopeful. It's slow. It's too slow. So I think the only thing you can say is, why is it so slow and a bit clunky? That's what I would say. But I think it is working.
Thank you, Mark.
Just before Claire comes back to that, I've got a comment from the floor that reads as follows. My father was on the village hall committee in the 70s, and they collected all the paper in the village in a skip for recycling to earn money for the village. Why don't people do this sort of community scale collection much these days? Claire, can you pick that up plus Mark's comment?
Well, I suppose that's the local authorities have picked up that responsibility, haven't they, and provided those services now through requirements that's what they need to provide, a recycling service as well as a residual service. I mean, there are still cash for cans schemes out there. There are some community schemes still around, but the convenience of us all being able to separate our recyclables at home and just do it at home means that's the way our society's gone, hasn't it? That
Claire, let me interrupt with another comment from the floor. You're obviously overexciting people. One of the issues appears to be on the label that says contact your waste local disposal service to find out if this material can be recycled locally. Surely we should have information to allow people to recycle on a community-wide basis rather than individual local resources.
Okay, so there was 3 labels, and one of them used to say check locally, and they were mainly put on sort of items that there wasn't enough local authorities regularly collecting or collecting everything at curbside. So there was that check locally, but OPRL, who are the custodians of the packaging label, have now switched to sort of being a sort of binary yes, no. So that should be changing, but it does take time for labels and systems to change. I mean, Matthew will say, people don't just change their print run of their packaging willy-nilly. It might take a year or so for that new information to come through. And of course, waste and recycling infrastructure, going back to the pounds, shillings and pence, needs to be done at scale so that it can be economically viable. We can't just have micro systems because they're not yet proven to be economically viable. So you will have the big PET reprocessing plants and the big glass furnace, cullets and remelts, because that will be next to where you make glass bottles again, because that's just how it works. So until some of those micro solutions come on, I mean, I always just think, I mean, I'm not that technical really, but I kind of think, why haven't I got just an extruder at home where I just put my bottles in and I just create a wire and I just 3D print new things? I mean, if I felt like it, I mean, that might be the future, mightn't it? That we all just create our own material at home, download something and print off our own toaster.
Yeah, come on, Matthew, why can't we?
Look, I love the vision. But from an operations standpoint, just the energy inefficiency of that kind of micro process today, based on the way we do things, would probably make that have a really, really bad carbon footprint overall, right? So you'd save on transport and you'd save on some sorting and other things along those lines, but you'd require quite a bit of energy to melt that plastic and then remelt it again once you go to finally use it. But the vision is awesome, right? You've got your coffee machine, your toaster, and your extruder. I love it. I come back to the labeling question, though. Part of the issue that we have really across the world is that recycling and garbage collection and things along those lines are all highly localized. So the labeling standards tend to be as generic as they possibly can, so that you don't have to have different labels for every single local jurisdiction or even country jurisdiction, right? You try and make them somewhat generic so you get some economies of scale. But that makes it really difficult for the end user, for that citizen, to make a decision about what to do if they're confused, right? And again, they're just going to go back to whatever's easiest, or they're going to put it in the wrong place, to Claire's contamination point earlier, which is really quite bad. And we don't talk about that as a whole. We don't talk about what happens when you've got a recycling load that is contaminated, and therefore all of that ends up into the landfill because it's too hard to separate.
Rodrigo, we're just confusing the citizens, consumers, and linear drivers of our society. How do we deal with this?
I don't know. I don't know if I have the. Yeah, but...
I mean, it's a real question. I mean, I'm actually getting various flashing lights. Sorry, Rodrigo. We're in the last few minutes. Could I ask all the panel to answer one final question? And it is a final question, but you have time to say one or two things. We've had an event today about packaging. We've talked about sustainability. In the last 55 minutes, I felt that we've opened more questions than we've closed. Could I just ask each of the panel, and I'm going to start with you, Rodrigo, if I may. If you were to give the listening audience or the watching audience one piece of advice personally and professionally regarding sustainability and packaging, what would it be?
Would we just use common sense? I think that's it.
I feel the Royal Society may have to examine 2 or 3 days symposium around an expose of what common sense is. Matthew, one piece of advice personally and professionally.
So mine is quite related, and I would say both on the personal and professional level, just take a moment to step back and think, right? Think through the unintended consequences, think through the ramifications, and then make your decisions, your final decisions at least after that, whether that's how to dispose of a product or what's actually needed in the packaging or the product itself when you're manufacturing.
Claire.
Yeah, I think mine's pretty similar to Matthew. I think on a personal front, I think take some responsibility, know what your local system is, know what can and can't be accepted within your recycling scheme at home, and make sure everybody in your family does the same thing and knows all of that. I think professionally, I think we need to just be aware of the power of the marketing. We talk to many people in businesses in the sort of sustainability side of businesses, and they want to do the right thing. And then sometimes when it goes over to the brand manager or somewhere else, you know, that's where it goes wrong. I mean, when I first joined RAP, I came in as a glass sector manager, not that I was from the glass sector, but I was used to sort of managing programs. And I had a call once from a designer saying, we've got this brief and I just want to know about the recyclability. It's a glass bottle fused onto a plastic base with a metal rod in it. And I just went, don't ask me that, please. So I think, you know, you can't be greenwashing now and you know, anyone. So just think what you're putting on the market.
Mark, one piece of advice, personally and professionally. It's Friday afternoon, it's 5 o'clock, and you have got the last piece of advice.
Oh, well, I say to people, the world's unsustainable at present, even though we're now finally moving in the right direction. And the best thing, the only unambiguously good thing you can do is not particularly recycling or composting, it's just buy less. If you buy less, then less carbon will go into the atmosphere. It's probably the only way you can really guarantee that. And we all need to do our bit to get less carbon into the atmosphere. And so just buying less. So when you're tempted with that finger over the thing to buy that thing, do what Matthew and Claire are saying to you. Just think, do we really need this? Is it really going to last 10 years, 20 years of my life? And then don't press that button. And instead, go to the pub and use a reusable glass to have a reusable, well, not reusable, but a lovely glass of beer. And contribute to your local community by spending your money that way.
Mark, thank you very much. Could I take the opportunity to first and foremost thank the four on the panel in the last hour for sharing their views personally and professionally. Rodrigo, Mark, Claire, Matthew, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. As I said right at the start, my only disappointment is the four of us can't go down Mark's local pub now and continue this conversation, because I think we could certainly continue it. As the closing of today is now, can I also say one or two little thank yous? I mentioned the speakers this afternoon. I'd also mention all the speakers for sharing their time, expertise, and knowledge. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. My co-organizer, Jaspal, thank you very much. It's been lovely to work with you. And I can't let this one pass without mentioning the Royal Society for Lorna and Harry, who frankly have made my job incredibly easy this afternoon. As a last one for me, can I just say thank you to the audience for their questions, their comments. We got through most of them, I think would be the comment. I hope you have been both challenged and stimulated by your attendance today. And it only remains with me to wish everybody an enjoyable, safe, and healthy weekend. Thank you very much.